What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of this week's episode, where we're going to talk about continuing education, specifically as it pertains to our biennial or sometimes triennial license renewal requirements. I already know I'm gonna get flack for this one. I don't know why, but people have really strong feelings about this, so I'm ready. I mean, feel free to bring it on in the comments. I already know it's gonna happen. But, just know that I mean well. I'm just presenting some information and some thoughts. As always, everything I'm going to talk about today just reflects my opinion. It does not constitute professional advice. And I do have some thoughts and opinions that I'd like to share. Now, I can't make a universal blanket statement because there are just so many states in the US, as well as so many different types of licenses to become a therapist, that I can't check every single licensing board to see if this is true. But I did poke around pretty extensively just to double check what I thought was true. And it does seem to be the case that for the most part, pretty much across the board, every state and also every license requires that you get a certain amount of CEs or continuing education either every year or every other year or every 3 years as part of your license renewal process. I just know one of you listening is in a state or has a license type that isn't following that structure, and you're going to leave a comment, and I want to hear that comment because I'm curious who's doing it differently than this setup. But as far as I can tell, for the most part, most states and most types of licenses, MFTs, social work psychologists, etc., are requiring continuing education courses in order to renew our licenses. Now, I'm a little nervous this is going to come across overly inflammatory, but I'm just presenting an opinion, just a Marie experience in my own little bubble. And for me, at least, I've experienced most continuing education contexts as not especially helpful. There are exceptions to that, definite exceptions to that. If I'm wanting to get trained in a new specific type of theoretical orientation or implementing a very specific kind of skill, I find that a continuing education context is a very helpful starting point for doing that. Certainly not a fully inclusive end-all be-all place to learn everything, though most people would suggest getting some supervision and consultation and things if you're implementing new theoretical strategies and things like that. But to be completely honest, every 2 years when it was time for me to renew my license, it would be the last few months but leading up to my license renewal, and I'd just be cramming in a bunch of CEs in order to be able to fulfill the requirement in order to renew my license. I don't think they were actually doing anything beneficial for the furthering of my education or my effectiveness as a therapist or anything like that. Not to mention that CEs cost money, so I'm spending time and money on something that is not really benefiting me. It's just so I can mostly check a box to get my license renewed. Hot take, I know, but I know I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one who's cramming those CEUs at the last minute and finding them generally not helpful. But I just yesterday renewed my license as a California psychologist for the next 2 years, and I will say this renewal cycle was pleasantly so much different. Let me explain. So as a California psychologist, my governing board is the Board of Psychology in California. And as of January 1st, 2023, they rolled out a completely new set of requirements in order to renew your license. It used to be that you had to complete 36 hours of continuing education every 2 years with some specifics mixed into that in order to renew your license. And that was pretty much it, aside from filling out a little application and paying a fee. And generally around the time when my license was up for renewal, I'd go back, see how many continuing education units I had, and I'd have a chunk of units that I completed, authentically wanting to have signed up for those because I wanted to learn something new or enhance my learning in some way, but it would be nowhere near the 36-hour requirement. It would usually be somewhere closer to 15 or 20 hours. And then the last couple of months before my license was up for renewal, I'd be cramming in those last CEs, just trying to meet the requirement. But as of January 2023, California psychologists now have a completely different set of requirements. Instead of being required to complete 36 hours of continuing education units, we're now required to complete 36 hours of continuing professional development. So the way the California Board of Psychology has broken down CPD is into 4 categories, and in order to complete your 36 required hours of CPD, you must have utilized CPD from at least 2 of those 4 categories in order to renew your license. There are some requirements within those 36 hours. 4 of them have to be related to laws and ethics, and 4 of them have to be related to cultural diversity or social justice. However, that's included in the 36 hours and can come from any of the 4 categories of CPD. The Board of Psychology started giving us heads up about this change well in advance of 2023, and even for the year of 2023, they let you choose whether you did CEUs or CPD to renew your license. But now, as of 2024, anyone renewing their license right now has to use the new CPD model. I really started learning about this new CPD model around 2022, and I'll be honest, at first, I was completely overwhelmed. To me, initially, it felt like things were getting more complicated. I used to be able to just do 36 hours of continuing education and renew my license, and now you're asking me to do, a bunch of different stuff to renew my license, and now I have to jump through more hoops, I guess, in order to maintain my license. And based on some of the comments that I'm able to find online, I'm not the only one who had this reaction, but now that I've personally gone through a full cycle of renewing my license using this new CPD model, I am fully bought in. I think this makes way more sense than the CE-based model that almost every licensure renewal is based upon across the US. And I'm going to explain a little bit why, because I think the Board of Psychology in California is one of the very few that's following this model right now. And this feels important to say before a bunch of you freak out. If you are a therapist in California, but you're not a psychologist, you do not have these CPD rules underway yet. If your board of licensure is the BBS, they are still operating under their existing prior model. So just clarifying that. So I'm going to describe a little bit more of this CPD model and how I ended up implementing it in my licensure renewal so you can kind of get a feel for what it's like. I'm pulling all of this information directly from the California Board of Psychology website. I'll link to all my references below in case you want to check things out for yourself. So I mentioned that CPD, or continuing professional development, has 4 categories, and each license renewal period, psychologists have to complete CPD from 2 of the 4 categories at a minimum. And the 4 categories of CPD are professional activities, academic, sponsored continuing education, or board certification. So that 3rd category of sponsored continuing education is pretty much CEs as I've known them up till now. So you can still utilize CEs towards your licensure, but you can't exclusively use CEs towards your licensure. There's these 3 other categories that are like a whole new ballgame, and you have to include at least one of those categories when you renew your license. So breaking them down a little bit further, in the first category of professional activity, that includes things such as peer consultation, practice outcome monitoring, professional services, conference or convention attendance, examination functions, expert review or consultation, and attendance at a California Board of Psychology meeting. I'm not going to break down each of these because, I attended a 3-hour webinar where the Board of Psychology broke down all of these things so I knew what they were, and I'm not going to spend 3 hours reiterating them here. They actually have a recording of that on their website, so I'll link to that below if you're interested. But just looking at this category like peer consultation, I meet with my consult group every 2 weeks, whether it counts towards my licensure renewal or not. So you can max out at 18 hours of peer consultation counting towards your licensure renewal. I'm going to hit that within a matter of just a few months without making any changes to my schedule, and that's already half of my license renewal requirements. As we continue through this episode, I think you'll see that I'm going to be making a case for why a continuing professional development model makes more sense when it comes to our license requirements and our renewal requirements rather than a more traditional continuing education model. And this is one reason why. There's things that we're doing to continue our professional development, most of us at least, that will already be able to count. So even though when I first heard about CPD being in these 4 different categories and I thought, oh no, I got to add even more activities to my schedule, where am I going to put them? From my experience, it was quite the opposite, where I realized I was doing so many things already to further my professional development that by the time that I got to my license renewal, there was only 5 hours left that I needed to complete because I had checked so many boxes already and even maxed out a bunch of them. And the second category of CPD is academic, which includes academic coursework, academic or sponsor-approved continuing education instruction, supervision, publications, and self-directed learning. So if you're auditing a class, or maybe you're already licensed and you're going back to graduate school for a different degree, you can count some amount of your academic coursework towards your license renewal requirements. Or if, let's say, you're completing an intensive training for some new theoretical model that you've learned and you're getting outside supervision for it, you can count some amount of those supervision hours for it. And there's even self-directed learning included in this academic category of CPD. The BOP says this includes, quote, independent educational activities focused on maintaining, developing, or increasing conceptual and applied competencies that are relevant to psychological practice, education, or science, such as reading peer-reviewed journal articles or books, watching videos or webcasts, or listening to podcasts. And in order to prove that you've done this activity, all you need to do is record the date, the medium, such as a book or a webinar, the topic or title, and the total number of hours. And I believe, if I remember correctly, you can do up to 6 hours just of self-directed learning, which, again, I'm reading books and listening to podcasts and all of that anyway during my license renewal period. So as I went back, I looked and realized, I can definitely max out this category without doing any extra work. And then, of course, category number 3, sponsored continuing education, is just CEs or CEUs as we've known them typically. It's still on there. You can still do that, but that one does max out at 27 hours. So you can't do all of your continuing professional development as CEs, but 27 hours, you can do most of it as CEs if you want to kind of stick to the more traditional model. And the last category is board certification. So you can get the initial earning of a specialty certification in an area of psychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology, and that could potentially count for 100% of your required CPD in the renewal cycle when you are awarded that certification, or if you do the senior option, it could count for 50%. And I know this probably looks different across different jurisdictions, different licensing boards, but up until this renewal cycle, whenever I did my CEs, I was required to have a printout of all the different requirements that the CEs I completed met, and proof that I did the completion quiz questionnaire thing and all of that. And I needed to keep those handy in case I was ever audited by the Board of Psychology. I could show proof that I'd completed all of my requiring continuing education. And now it's really shifted to more of an honor system, at least for a lot of the categories of CPD. For example, 4 of our hours of CPD need to be connected to cultural diversity or social justice, and I decided to fulfill that requirement by reading the book Decolonizing Therapy. So rather than trying to find a way to prove that I most definitely read that book, there's just a place for me to write in how long I read this book, what date it was that I completed those 4 hours, and that's it. It's the honor system, which I really appreciate because I know I'm going to complete all the licensure requirements, and my staying up late at night nightmare situation is more about whether I lose the documentation that proves that I definitely completed the CEs rather than whether I'm actually going to complete the CEs. I'm going to follow through and follow the rules. And unfortunately with CEs, there's so many ways that you can kind of game the system and not really do CEs, but show that you met the requirements, that at the end of the day, if you're going to game the system, you're going to find a way to game the system. So having the honor system in place feels just much more respectful. It starts to feel a little bit less like policing and a little more trusting that as a clinician, I'm going to do the best I can, at least to maintain my own professional development. Now, I understand from direct experience that if this is the first time that you're just learning about the CPD model, it can feel really overwhelming. How do you even keep track of what counts versus not towards your license renewal? Of course, you can always reach out directly to the board to double check. They did what they can to try to lay out what counts in their available resources online. And again, I'll link to those below if you're interested in learning more. But kind of like with everything, once I actually went through it for the first time, it ended up feeling like much more integrated and suddenly not so overwhelming. And now it feels like as I go into the next 2-year renewal cycle, I can have all those categories sort of floating in the back of my head, and I'll just be logging in all my professional development activities from month to month as I complete them. I think some folks critiquing the Board of Psychology for making this change are taking on a sort of like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mindset, where they're so used to doing things one way and now you're changing the rules on us and now I have to learn a new set of rules, and that's just more work when I was able to meet the requirements before. But earlier this year, I attended a webinar run by the Board of Psychology where they went over all of these changes and also shared a little bit about the reasoning behind making these changes. And at least what they said were things that I found quite promising. They acknowledged the flaws in the CE model, which I think most of us can kind of see through pretty easily. And they were also looking to pretty immediately target how much isolation and burnout is such a problem amongst therapists, and trying to find ways to support therapists getting support, basically. So if you do things like include peer consultation as part of your licensure requirements, hopefully more therapists will then be motivated to seek out peer consultation, and that may even have more value than going and spending more hours in front of a computer doing continuing education hours. Not only will that have more value in the sense that you have some peer support, but honestly, I end up learning way more in consult group than I do from continuing education. I don't know if that's just me, but that's definitely true of me. And you could make a case that a lot of the different activities that count as CPD are much more interactive, much more communal, and therefore are more supportive to overall therapist well-being, and that being a very important part of our professional development. Now, I'm having this parallel experience as I'm recording this episode because I know I'm telling you, I think this model is pretty great. Personally, it works better for me. It made my licensure renewal process so much smoother, so much more enjoyable, and just easier, honestly, easier to complete. However, I know that my experience is not necessarily reflective of the majority, or there's at least a very loud minority of people reflecting their critiques against this system. So as I'm recording this episode, I'm just imagining that at least some of you, if not most of you on the other side of this, are listening, hearing like, this does not sound like a good idea. So I want to make sure I give voice to that. And the only reason it even was flagged for me that people are not into this idea is because when I attended that 3-hour webinar put on by the Board of Psychology giving an overview of CPD requirements, in the Q&A sections of that webinar, there were some very pissed off people. Like, it's one thing to say, I don't like this or I'm confused, but there were people who were pissed, like took it personally that the Board of Psychology is trying to attack us, trying to make it harder for us. And I don't know, maybe there's some conspiracy behind that, or maybe it's just completely merited, who knows? But I want to give voice to some of those critiques so that you can hear them. Now, as the Board of Psychology went through the process of advocating for these changes, they had these open comment periods where people were able to send in their comments, critiques, changes they wanted the board to make, and then they responded accordingly. And those comments are now publicly available. So I thought I would read some of the comments that had a little bit more of a critique to them. But before we get into those, I'd like to thank Powbox for sponsoring today's episode. HIPAA compliance is always top of mind for me, so I was completely surprised when I learned that Google Workspace and Microsoft 365 alone are not enough to be HIPAA compliant, even if you have a signed BAA with them. I know. That's why a little over a year ago, I started using Powbox, which is the simplest, most effective solution for mental health professionals to seamlessly integrate HIPAA security into your email, all while using your favorite email provider. I genuinely was surprised by how easy it was to set up. In about 10 minutes, I had Powbox set up and fully integrated with my Google Workspace, and I haven't had to touch it once since then. But I can rest assured knowing it's keeping all my clients' correspondence with me secure without having to log into a portal to communicate with benefit them. If you'd like to give Powbox a try, they're running a great offer right now where the first 100 people who say my name at sign up get $250 off their first year. To get the deal, just head to powbox.com and mention Marie Fang at sign up. That's Powbox spelled Paubox.com. Thank you again to Powbox for sponsoring this episode, and now let's get into some of those critiques. Here someone says, "It is concerning that the board is holding licensees to a standard seemingly above other professions, such as medical boards. Rather than expand the options for CPD and learning, the regulations require it. There is also concern I have on the fiscal impact of meeting requirements on licensees." And here the board replies, "The board appreciates this comment." So PC. "This comment does not address changes made to the second modified regulation text. No text changes are required in response to this comment." Basically, we're like, we don't need to do anything with your comment. So this commenter is naming a few concerns here. First, they're saying that the board is holding us to a standard higher than other professions like medical boards. I am married to a physician. Let me tell you, his license renewal process is way more rigorous than mine. I don't know what to say. They have exams. Like, we don't have exams. Does anyone listening have exams as part of their license renewal process? Like, that would be a doozy. Like, if you had to redo the EPPP every single time you renewed your license, that would be way more work. Anyway, just saying. And they're saying, rather than just expanding the options for CPD, they're requiring it, which is an interesting case to say, well, couldn't you just leave it an option if you wanted to do all of your hours via CEs that you could? And though the cap is at, I forget if it was 26 or 27 hours, most of your hours can be completed via CEs. You are required to pick from one other category as well. And I think for me, I appreciate that because there's so much more to maintaining our own professional development than attending seminars and conferences. And there's more to being a great therapist than that, in my humble opinion. And then this person brings up concern that it might somehow cost more, which is hard for me to see that personally. I counted so many hours of peer consultation, which at least mine is totally free. It's just me and 2 other therapist friends, and we meet every other week. We don't charge anybody anything for it. And I maxed out 6 hours of reading a book. And I had to pay money for the books, but that's way more affordable than 6 hours of CEs. So I think if you want it to be more expensive, you can, but that's true about most things in life. I think it's actually much easier for it to be cheaper if you want it to be. Now, this comment feels particularly inflamed. Someone says, quote, "As psychologists consider taking on the extraneous activities proposed in the new regulation, we plan to retire or reduce our caseloads in order to accommodate these changes. Part-time practices will be eclipsed by the board's additional requirements." So the way that this person comments, it sounds as though the board is requiring us to do a bunch of stuff above and beyond the already required 36 hours of continuing education, which, if they were expanding the hours in a significant way, I could see that being very upsetting. But it's still the same number of hours, and they're just opening up opportunities for all the different ways you can complete those hours. If anything, I would advocate for, it's much easier to fit those things in your schedule. First of all, mostly because you probably already have them in your schedule. And I would make a case that you should have these things in your schedule. And ethically, we're encouraged to have a lot of these types of things in our schedule. And so if anything, if you're working part-time or, you're getting closer to retirement, it's much easier for you to complete these requirements than the CE expectation. Unless you were kind of cheating on your CEs and you weren't actually putting in the 36 hours, which I'm sure is true for some. There were also quite a number of comments saying that the cultural diversity requirement every 2 years is too much in different ways. Here someone says, quote, "The addition of cultural diversity and or social justice requirements seems important to add. However, every 4 years seems over the top," which, I feel like that just kind of highlights the problem to me. We should definitely be putting way more energy into this. I don't even know if I have anything fruitful to add in response, except that I'm really grateful that this requirement was added on and that every 2 years we're expected to have spent at least 4 hours of our time focused on cultural diversity, which again could be from a book, a podcast, peer consultation, places where we probably should be learning and talking about that regardless. Is that a hot take? I don't know. It's fine if it is. I'm still going to hold to it. Again, everything I'm saying is totally in my opinion. And here I thought the board's response to someone's comment was illuminating on the, like, why do we need to have things from 2 categories? For example, why couldn't we just get all 36 hours from CEs? They say the reason for requiring 2 categories is that this ensures adequate breadth and is consistent with research, but will not disadvantage psychologists who may have difficulty or limitations in participating in more than 2 categories. Yeah, so it's kind of like, hey, if you're able to participate in more than 2 categories, that sounds great. But if all of your hours of continuing professional development just look like sitting in front of a computer learning, like, that's probably not adequate to feel like it captures what maintaining your own professional development looks like. Again, is this a hot take? Like, I don't feel like it's a hot take, but I just know hearing the way people have responded, just I think it might sound like a hot take to other people, I guess. But I'm curious, as you hear about this, like, do you have any reactions to this? Like, what do you think about the fact that at least the California Board of Psychology, overseeing psychologist license in the state of California, have made this move? It has happened. I renewed my license this way this year. This does seem to be like a kind of groundbreaking change as far as I can tell. If you live in a jurisdiction where you have very similar requirements for your licensure renewal, I'd love to hear from you in the comments and to see what you think of it, if that's the process you've been in as well. But I know most of you in the United States still have the traditional CE model for our requirements for licensure, and I'm curious, just hearing this CPD format, like, what are your reactions? Like, if you had the option to do it that way versus the way your state currently has it set up, like, which one would you prefer? I just think it's really interesting, and anytime there's a radical change, there will always be naysayers, because that's kind of the nature of change. And also, usually the first iterations of change tend to be pretty messy. So I'm imagining there's going to be some hiccups, some kinks in the system that kind of need to be fleshed out a little bit. But I feel really hopeful that this might be a direction that things can move towards. It's trending in the right direction, again, in my opinion, and I'm just wondering what other people think. And part of the reason why I wanted to make this video, even though I imagine it might not get a whole ton of views relative to other videos, is I want to use this platform well and kind of like get information out there that feels useful. And to me, at least, if more people knew about this, then maybe more people might advocate for it in their jurisdictions if they think it would make licensure renewal more accessible, more productive, more cost-effective, etc. So this is me saying what I want to say on my platform, hoping that it's helpful. That sums up what I do here. I say stuff hoping it's helpful. Well, this might have been a little bit rambly. I hope you found this interesting and maybe helpful. And if you're a California psychologist and your license is up for renewal soon, hopefully this helps you as well. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts and reactions are in the comments. Just like, be respectful, but tell me what you think. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.